Welcome to the Mockingcast, the podcast of Mockingbird Ministries. I'm David Zoll, your host, and in a few moments, I'll be joined by my co-hosts, Sarah Condon and RJ Heyman. We come to you every other week to discuss a few of the places where we currently see grace and its absence playing out in unexpected and compelling ways. We're glad to have you with us.
Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. God.
Well, I don't know what's going on with you two. I hope to find out here in the next few minutes, but I am sitting in a town that has had more snow dumped on it.
What a blessing.
More school canceled. I mean, it's beautiful. We are washed white as white as snow.
So Christian.
The gospel songs are playing in my heart. At least I'm hoping they continue to, because this is, it's like, again,
Groundhog Day?
an interruption of biblical proportions, and I have to try to say thank you as much as I can, even if I don't mean it. And in my inner Dave is screaming at the skies. I
got a forecast for you, sweetheart. It's going to be long. It's going to be dark. It's going to last you the rest of your life.
Oh my gosh! I don't think I've watched that movie with my kids yet.
Oh
You
my
should.
God! Well, now you know what you're doing today.
This is the day, yeah.
Yeah. Well, we got plenty of time, and we've got lots of time with
Tis the
each
season,
other.
also. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that's me. I'm also grateful to be alive and to be talking to the two of you. So,
Yeah.
what's happening? We got some really fun things to talk about today. But before we do, how's it going? What do you got, Sarah?
We're plugging along. I mean, I don't know. This season of ministry is intense. Josh needs to hire someone to help him, and his assistant, took a job earlier this year, and I'm really ready for him to have more help. So yeah, this is and maybe this is just me sending him a voice memo, because he does faithfully listen to our podcast. So get on it, babe.
Well, let me ask you this:
They're not talking otherwise. But
This is the only way you communicate is through the podcast. Unload the dishwasher. Yeah,
the towels in the bathroom.
we're good. I mean, we talk a lot. Like, we have been through much more intense seasons of ministry, as you well know, than this one. It's just, we're in it, and we're at that stage. I mean, RJ warned me about this when we worked together years and years ago. You said there's going to come a time when your kids are going to want to stay up with you, and you and Josh are not going to have any time together at night. And yeah, so it's sort of all coalescing right now. We were with friends last weekend, and I have to say, we just had such a good social weekend. I'm really the whole conversation about having more parties, we're doing a lot more of it, and it's so fun. Everybody should be doing it. But we were with friends, and they were saying, I never understood why people put TVs in their bedrooms until we had teenagers. And it's
totally,
because you're just
I was like, who does that? That's
does
come on. That's just so counterproductive. Then
And now I'm
teenagers
like,
comes now, yes.
Okay,
And a lock on your door.
Yeah. Yeah. So anyway.
Television and a lock.
Rutger?
We're okay. My mom is in town, which is really fun. Hillary Heyman, who I love, for the next few weeks. And my brother Daniel and his son are coming down. They live in Brooklyn, so get a little bit of Florida sunshine. I have a high school friend coming in. I haven't seen in 25 years with her husband, so it should be a really fun weekend. There's a lot of things to be thankful for. God is faithful. I think a lot about, Sarah, the talk you gave at Mockingbird, I think last year, where you talked about how, when you got married, and I've said that, I've used this with couples before, that when you got married, you didn't realize that what you were basically doing was signing up to suffer together for the rest of your life, and that's true, but I'm grateful that we get to do it together.
Yeah.
Because I love that chick,
Yeah.
So it's at a very busy season, baptisms and confirmation and new member classes. And this is kind of the height of the thing. So, good and bad, but God is faithful, and good to be with you guys right now.
Oh,
so,
yeah. Well, lots happening here besides the snow. We are making more and more preparations for New York. Hope
Yeah.
folks sign up for that. It is filling up, and I hate to say it, if you don't act in the next, I don't know, month or so, you might not have space when it happens. Tara Isabella
You'll be
Burton
turned away at the door.
No one ever gets turned away. Don't worry.
We're bringing a group from St. B's, so
It's gonna be so
gonna be
great.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah, we just the final speaking slot was Tara Isabella Burton, who's we've talked about her a number of times on here. She's a fantastic writer and really a sort of preeminent religion reporter, but also an author in her own right. Will be speaking on Saturday morning, in addition to Harrison Scott Key and Elizabeth Oldfield, and all sorts of. There's lots of surprises, so I'm excited about that. But also the Holy Spirit issue of our magazine. I mentioned it at the very end of the last podcast, but that ships on February 19th. And again, if you're not subscribed, I'm not going to shame you, but what is I want to get right up to that.
We're just disappointed.
We're
just disappointed.
We just think less of you. So that's all I'll say. We also have this will come out after Valentine's Day, but that is happening in the world, at least in the non-snow covered world. And this first piece kind of touches on that. We talked about the ick last time. Today, we're going to talk about what's being called the relationship recession in America, but also the entire developed and developing world. Did not realize some of these statistics. This is by Derek Thompson, writing in The Atlantic about America's marriage material shortage. He begins by saying the share of 12th graders who say they've dated has fallen from about 85% in the 80s to less than 50% in the early 2020s, with the decline particularly steep in the past few years. And he says that has a lot to do with the retreat from sort of physical, embodied relationships, and there's the embodied world in general and the internet, etc. But he's really interested in what is happening to adult relationships. He says this: American adults are significantly less likely to be married or to live with a partner than they used to be. The national marriage rate is hovering near its all-time low, while the share of women under 65 who aren't living with a partner has grown steadily since the 1980s. The past decade seems to be the only period since at least the 1970s when women under 35 were more likely to live with their parents than with a spouse. According to Lyman Stone, a researcher at the Institute for Family Studies, the most important reason marriage and coupling are declining in the U.S. is actually quite straightforward. Many young men are falling behind economically. A marriage or romantic partnership, Thompson writes, can be many things: friendship, love, sex, someone to gossip with, someone to remind you to take out the trash. But practically speaking, Stone told me, marriage is also insurance. Women have historically relied on men to act as insurance policies against the threat of violence and the risk of poverty. To some, this might sound like an old-fashioned, even reactionary description of marriage, but its logic still applies. Stone says, men's odds of being in a relationship today are still highly correlated with their income. Women do not typically invest in long-term relationships with men who have nothing to contribute economically. In the past few decades, young and especially less educated men's income has stagnated, even as women have charged into the workforce and seen their college graduation rates soar. For single, non-college educated men, average inflation-adjusted earnings at age 45 have fallen by nearly 25% in the past half century, while for the country as a whole, average real earnings have more than doubled. As a result, quote, a lot of young men today just don't look like what women have come to think of as marriage material. He goes on to say, in the past 40 years, coupling has declined more than twice as fast among Americans without a college degree compared with college graduates. This represents a dramatic historic inversion. In 1980, Americans ages 25 to 34 without a bachelor's degree were more likely than college graduates to get married. Today, it's flipped, and the education gap in coupling is widening every year. Marriage produces wealth by pooling two people's income, but conversely, wealth also produces marriage. He concludes by saying the social crisis of our time is not just that Americans are more socially isolated than ever, but also that social isolation is rising alongside romantic isolation as the economic and cultural trajectories of men and women move in opposite directions. He cites other research in there about how coupling around the world, from Iran to Wales, is also going down. And the reason this matters is not necessarily because people are invested in sort of families or coupling, but yes, because of fertility rates. It has a lot to do with fertility rates, but also rates of happiness, because the most reliable predictor of happiness is a romantic relationship, according to the data. Studies show, surveys indicate. So that's a lot to throw out there at the beginning of a podcast. What do you guys think? Sarah, you're a lady. Any
I mean, go to college. I don't know. Like, just like, I remember when I was in seminary and I was one of the only married people in seminary, and we were sitting in the refectory, which is stupid seminary talk for cafeteria. And one of my female peers was saying like that she really wanted to marry like an artist or a poet. She was young. And I just said, it was important to me to marry somebody who had health insurance. Like that,
insurance?
Yeah. I mean, I totally identify with that. I think
That's why you married Josh, right?
like,
didn't hurt, right?
But in all sincerity, like, it was like, military guys. Like, I was just like, and part of that is, right, I grew up with parents who were self-employed, and we always had terrible insurance when we had it. And I knew that was really important. And so, I am also wondering, like, with the healthcare crisis in this country, is that even more exacerbated in the way that, like, we're all thinking about partnering up? We know couples who've gotten married because they could get on each other's insurance. Like, I think there's a lot at play. I would hesitate to say it's just about men without college degrees earning less. I mean, I that seems like kind of too, I think there's too much happening to just say it's that one thing. I think a use and abuse of pornography online and sort of men having these wildly different and perverse sexual expectations of women is like a huge issue. I just think there's a lot. And I have girlfriends who are single, and it's bleak. The options are pretty bleak. So I kind of hope my kids meet a spouse in college. I mean, truly, because I think it's just harder and harder and harder.
Yeah. Elizabeth Callan wrote an unbelievable essay for Mockingbird called Dying Alone. It's about her experiences with dating. She's in her mid-30s and sounds like dying to meet someone, and the difficulties in that, and the way that you equate your relationship status with your self-worth, and the way that the dating industrial complex kind of boils everything down to what you're doing wrong.
Yeah.
And
but all anybody ever wants at the end of the day is to come home and like eat carbohydrates together. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like it's also become so complicated because there's so many requirements now for this person, right? And I will say, from a female perspective, like, if you go on Instagram, and we've talked about this before, and you see these girls that are like all the red flags and all the ick factor and it's just like, it just is. Then it's like, well, who the hell is a candidate for this marriage? Like, who do you think exists?
It's like the expectations have gone out of control on both sides. It sounds
right. We're not as social. We're not as good at being social. And our ability to meet those expectations is so much lower.
Well, RJ, you're suffering with someone every single day. It sounds like I
love her so much.
The patron saint of this podcast.
Seriously, the one who saved me from saying fireable things. Take that out. Gosh, I've got a lot of thoughts. I mean, one thing I will say, Sarah, because you brought up the pornography thing, that is definitely a factor. But I do think it actually sort of cuts both ways. I mean, it's definitely more of a thing for guys, but I think it's both ways. I do think, yeah, it's not just Instagram; it's just television too. Like you
Yeah.
watch sitcoms and movies from 30 years ago, and like there's chipped paint on the garage door, and the grass is a little shabby, and not everyone has had plastic surgery. And now you watch every TV show, and no matter the socioeconomic, like you watch like Modern Family, for example, which I know is probably not even shown anymore. But this middle class family, the Dunphys, clearly lives in like a $4 million house in
Right.
Beverly Hills. You know what I mean?
Right,
Like it's
right.
and that's put forward as like middle class. It's like that is
Yeah.
not at all middle class. And I think also people satisfy a lot of their relational urges through television. They feel like they're part of the community in Community or Friends or The Office or whatever it is, and they expel so much relational energy through media. But I think the bigger thing is, and I'd hope that this would be true for Christians, we need to decouple thinking about relationships from economics. We have to, because the most important decision you will ever make is who you marry, and not the job you're going to have or where you're going to work or your career path. And it just always makes me sad when I hear someone say, well, I met this person, I'm so in love with them, but the timing just isn't right, and I have to go take this job in this city 1,000 miles away. And I sort of want to be like, if you ever fall in love with someone, it's a total miracle. Like if you find someone that you like, that likes you, that you're best friends together, that you share a similar sense of humor, that you are physically attracted to each other, like value that, prioritize that. I was talking with a woman recently at church. She has a kind of 20-something-year-old and young 20s, like probably 2021 grandson. And I'd seen him in church maybe 6 months ago with this girl that I'd never seen before. I was like, "Oh, is your son still with that girl?" It's like, "Yeah." And they're talking about marriage. And she's like, I'm telling him to slow down. And I was like, "Well, do you like her?" She's like, "Oh my gosh, I love her." I was like, "Is she good for him?" She's like, "She is so good for him." Like, does she have a good head on her shoulders? Like, absolutely. But her thing was like, he has to finish college and get a job, and then we'll talk about it, which is like 4 or 5 years away.
Right.
And I'm like, I get that. That makes sense. But I also know, I mean, Jamie and I got married at 23. People thought we were a little crazy.
Yeah.
I know. I mean, John
23,
O'Linebaugh,
yeah.
friend of the show, got his doctorate at Durham, taught at Cambridge, now is the head of the Anglican Studies program at Beeson. Amazing. He and Megan got married in college at Messiah and said it was the most amazing thing, and not everyone's ready for that. But historically, people got married like in their teens, and I don't know, like, I'm just saying, who you marry is more important than your career path. We need to prioritize relationship over economics. And chances are, if you find the right person who loves you and supports you and knows you and sees you, that's going to just have massive positive implications for your career path and for the rest of your life together,
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, except like I do think like women we have to think a little bit more strategically, economically. I mean, I think that's like that was certainly real for me. Like it just was like, and it didn't mean that I like fell in love with someone and was like, I can't marry this guy. It just meant that the guys that I was like, oh, you're like a line cook at the restaurant I waitress at in college. No, I'm not going to date you. Like that was just a real thing for me, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's true. I will say, and this is like, I thought of you guys because we've talked about this before. Anecdotally, we were at a party this weekend, and one of the women there who's got a daughter who's like around early 20s, she was saying her friends are starting to get married. Like it's a wild thing. And I'm kind of wondering, and actually I'm starting to see Rice kids get married who are also who are in their early 20s.
I love it.
I know. And so I'm kind of wondering what's going on there.
I hope they're doing some premarital counseling. I'll just say that. Like, have they talked about kids yet? Do a little premarital counseling. Just to make sure that you talked,
Yeah, I mean, I hear what you guys are saying, and I also I can think of 10 Christian couples who got married way too young, and
it was a total shit show.
Is a total disaster, and they got married only for like purity reasons,
Right.
or
Well,
because
see, but
of
that's
parents.
not the right reason. Yeah.
You're right. I mean, there's a lot of couples that get married because they want to be able to have sex. Like that was but I mean, I don't know that that's. I mean, we run in such different circles. I think that was really true in the 90s. I don't know that that's still the case.
Well, no
right?
one is having sex anymore, so
Yeah,
it's not a problem anymore.
What I think what I'm trying to, I don't think we're going to solve it, but I think as people who are involved in like this ministering to real folks and who are coming to church or just listening to the podcast, I think it's very important for those of us who are coupled off to remember that less and less people are, and that it's extremely difficult, and the compassion to extend to your single brothers and sisters who feel like everything is basically conditional. Like it's like, if I become this sort of person, then I will be loved, and then I will get this kind of mate, and I will have this kind of life. Like the message of the gospel is like basically the antithesis of that.
Yes.
And yet that's the world in which you have to marinate. And if it's becoming increasingly more competitive, and both sides, men and women, are becoming more and more demoralized, like, well, that informs at least these spiritual conditions in which we're trying to minister. And I'm not saying you start preaching, oh, let's all marry Jesus, but it's like, you realize that love and its pursuit is not an uncontended or uncontested or simple thing. Like,
No.
how many people do I know who like were in like what looked like a pretty good relationship headed towards marriage, and then after 8 years it fell apart, and all of a sudden they're in their mid 30s and they don't know if they don't want to have a family, all this stuff. It's like, that feels really existential. I mean, if you're 65, you feel a little differently, but it's I don't know. I feel for people. And how do we increase our compassion for the folks out there who are subject to not only their own self-defeating issues, but like these massive social shifts? Like it's very, I don't know what
and
else to
finding
say.
yourself in the middle of them, and like not under like I totally agree, because I think for women my age there was a pretty strong narrative, if you came from a family like mine, that like you were like supposed to go to college, you were supposed to work a job, you were supposed to be established, and then there like a lot of friends I have like looked up in their 30s and they were like, okay, but where are the guys now? Like that's a very, very real phenomenon, like, I mean, but I mean, I do think it points to like sort of the plans that we have and the ways we're going to establish ourselves. And then like, me getting married at 23, like it just like, we don't have any control over it also.
Did you get married at 23 too, Sarah?
I did, yeah.
Oh my God. And I remember you saying something like, we got married in a fever. Is that fair to say?
We met, got married, and moved to New York City in a year.
Yeah.
Yeah,
sounds sounds very responsible.
Yeah, I mean, we'd both just broken up with people that we had been basically engaged to. And so, our parents were like, my parents were like, what are you doing?
Textbook.
My dad literally said, because, I'd almost married the Jewish guy. My dad said, we had gotten used to the idea that Christmas was going to be ruined because you were going to marry somebody who's Jewish. And now it's going to be ruined because you're marrying a priest. So, it was great. But like, it was the best thing I ever did. It was the best,
well, all of us, though, we have like we can pontificate about what to do and how to go about it. But it's like you tell your own story. It's like, I had very little agency. This thing happened to me, and all of a sudden,
well, that's
I
what I
look
said
up
to this
and
grandma.
I'm married.
I was like, how old were you when you got married? And she's like, 22. But it was a different time. It was, and then she's like, RJ, you're supposed to be on my side. I'm like, I am on your side. I'm totally, and I'm also on his side. And I'm just,
Well, the link to finances, I think, is a real one. And RJ said a few weeks ago about like, how do you live in a culture that where money's not the most important thing, but everything you're being told all the time is that it actually is. This next piece was
when Jamie and I got married. The year we got married, combined, we made $28,000. We couldn't afford to go to the movies. We made our lunch. I ate PB&J every day for like 2 years.
Yet every married couple I know who'd had a period like that looks back on it as
it was amazing.
The best period of
it
all
was
time.
so great.
Yet again, it just goes to show what we think we want, what we need, and I know that there are actual real world things at stake.
Yes.
Folks. But this is really interesting. The New York Magazine tried to find people living in New York City whose lives were being subsidized by their parents.
Oh no.
They write these.
It's not hard to find.
These two reporters that will say, when you live in the wealthiest city in the world, it's not hard to come up with people you suspect have access to their parents' money. But when we set out to put faces to the general wealth that sustains this city's economy, finding people who would be willing to talk about it in minute detail was a very different project. In awkward conversations that occasionally became therapy sessions, 14 people answered our questions candidly. How much, how often, for what? Nearly all of them remarked that they hadn't ever talked about this with anyone else ever.
Mm.
So I'm going to read to you a few. We'll stop in between a couple of these folks, but it's really, really interesting what people say. This is the first person they talk about is a woman who's 39 years old, who's a psychologist who's crippled with guilt over privilege. She says this: I often feel that if my colleagues found out that I don't have PhD debt, they would be like, how do you relate to your patients? And are you really working hard? They might think I don't love the work as much as they do because there's just not as much on the line for me. I feel fortunate, but I have so much guilt. In fact, I've had so much guilt for so long that I developed an anxiety disorder I've had to treat and manage. There were periods when I didn't function well because it bothered me so much. I'll read one more and then we can talk about it. She talks about a social worker who lives in a huge apartment on Central Park that her grandparents own. And she says, right now my son is in free UPK4, which is preschool. He was able to get into the center I wanted because my family paid for the 1s and 2s program, which gives you priority admission. It's an equity nightmare, and I did it because I could. I'm waiting to see if he gets into one of those K through 12 schools that charges $65,000 a year for a 5-year-old. I beat myself up about this stuff, and then I do it anyway. And then I beat myself up about it again, and then I do it again. Personal wealth is not what you're worth. It's what you can activate. That's the word I use. If you have the button, what does it matter who installed it? If you have access to it, you have access to it. And if the people who put the button there give you the green light to push it whenever you want, it becomes harder to tell the difference between a want and a need. Actually, I'm going to read one more and then we'll keep going. This is
I think
a woman.
RJ is going to become undone if you keep reading these.
Well, this is, Sarah, you might get a kick out of this. This is a mother of 3, and my parents still pay for my keratin hair treatments.
Oh, God bless
And they
them.
also paid for my body waxing until my wedding because they thought I needed to get waxed to get married. The money is largely coming from my mom. The money is largely coming from my mom because she has guilt that we have a lot of unruly hair, and I inherited that from her. They've helped me with other financial situations, but it comes with a heavy hand. It comes with responsibility. So as much as I would love for them to pay for after-school activities and tutoring and private school tuition, I know that it'll just come with a lot. The keratin has no emotional ramifications. All right. RJ's got his face in his hands.
RJ's up because he's,
RJ lived in New York City for a long time and is
Oh,
never.
There are no
never met
trust fund.
someone.
There are no trust fund kids in Palm Beach at all.
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Well, what are we going to say that won't get cut here?
No, I guess I don't want to be accusatory towards anyone but myself, right? And when I listen to those, what I think I realize is, what came to mind is how many people who are not in that situation would give just about anything to be in that situation, right? And then, when you talk to people who actually are, it's awful. It's a nightmare. It causes anxiety and guilt. It ruins their relationships. They pass it down to their kids. It kind of makes me think, the lectionary this week is the Beatitudes, but it's the Luke Beatitudes, which honestly I like less than the Matthew Beatitudes. But Jesus does say, woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are full. And this article makes me think about that. Like all the things we think we want that will make us happy don't. And I just know so many families who have been torn apart because there was too much money. And they would just, and how much do we give? How do we split it up? Do we give enough? Do we give too much? Are you supporting us? And it's, I mean, every family has their problems. I mean, that's the other thing to remember, right? It's like my first boss in ministry, Dr. John Westfall, who I love. I went in as like a very idealistic, Berkeley graduate. And our first meeting together, I was like, 22. And I was just, bitching and moaning about all these rich people at the church and how hard it must be to serve with all these people who have all this money and don't care, blah, blah, blah. And he looks at me and goes, RJ, you have two problems. One is you have no respect for people. And two, you still think money matters. And I'll never forget that. And it was 100% true. So to me, that's the convicting thing is like, that's my dream. Like, I'd love to have more help from my parents, and I'd love to be able to help my kids. But, for people who are actually in that situation, and we've known people, I'm not sure it's the best thing. And also I'm sure they wrote about the people who were struggling. I'm sure all the people are like, oh yeah, it's great. I do whatever I want. I'm perfectly integrated. I got a happy marriage. My relationship with my parents is great. I'm sure that's also true for some people.
Well, I think no one wanted to talk about it in any regard. Like you self-select for some interesting characters. Sarah, before I hear from you, there's one more instance of this that we have to read. This is from a musician in his early 40s who writes this. He says, "My brother has been an active heroin addict for 25 years. At some point in family therapy, he told my mom, 'I'm never going to get clean if you don't stop giving me money.'
Wow.
And she never stopped giving him money. She
Wow.
just didn't know what to do, or she felt guilty. I really don't know." And then he says, "Family money sets you apart in a way that you don't decide. If people know you have money, they're going to think about you differently. And at some point you start to think, well, maybe that is who I am. For a long time, I felt my money was the only thing about me that had value. So I was using it kind of as a buffer to prevent people from actually knowing me. I just pay for everything, especially in a creative field. When people see someone who has the ability to do what they want, they'll latch onto that. They're not always operating out of malice, but because of my experience with addiction and the people who go along with that, I can be very guarded. I often feel like I'm waiting for something to go wrong in a relationship. A lot of that is rooted in this big secret I've kept for a long time, that he's access to massive amounts of inherited wealth." Sarah, we're just interested to hear what you have to say about this.
It's a weird thing to think about a little bit, I think, just because it feels a little alien to me. I mean, New York City has so much wealth, and you guys grew up more like in this sort of Northeastern thing that I didn't. And so, I mean, when we're talking about this level of wealth, though, that like your life is like fully supported in these ways is really wild. I do have a very good friend who is and this is like such a Mississippi thing, but she essentially is like her grandmother brought rural cable to Mississippi, like to the areas. Yeah, and so there was like a lot of money in that. And there's a lot of money in the family now. And she's got a brother who's gone to prison, and she's got kids she's raising on her own. And like, it's, and mom pays for some things and not for other things. And it all feels really complicated sometimes, I think. When my parents died and there was some money, nothing like what these people are dealing with in New York, but, they were dead, and that's different. Like it meant that like we could buy a house in Nashville. Like that's what it meant, I mean, and it also meant that there was no strings attached at all. And yeah, it's foreign to my experience too, because my parents never like stepped in that way. Like that would have been such a weird thing. I think we're all sort of a little freaked out by what that dynamic must be like. I don't know. It sounds really controlling and really dysfunctional, but also like, I would say, I think what you said is really important. Like the people self-select and these people who have self-selected almost feel like they were like dying to tell someone, right? Like this is a confessional experience for them.
Right.
And I do think that, I mean, I maybe my anthropology is too high, but I would hope that the way that you give money to your children is the way that you parent your children. And so I would hope that you would be able to recognize, when there's strings attached and when there's not. I mean, I know a guy I've worked with, who was very difficult to work for, very controlling. And, I know more than I want to know about like how he parents his adult children, and he's very controlling and very difficult. Like
I'm working on it, Sarah. I'm sorry.
I just think I don't know. I think how you give money is how you parent. I think if you're going to give your kids money, you
Mhm.
have to do it without restriction. And I think you also have to recognize when it's not good for them to be given this much. I mean, I
Like
think
with
that's
the heroin addict being like, you
yeah.
got to
I mean,
stop giving me money.
that's a huge yeah. Like, why are you still doing this?
And yet,
This
gosh,
is really uncomfortable to talk about though. Like I'm feeling very uncomfortable. Like everything I'm saying, I'm like, should I not say that? Should I not say that? So it's a
yeah.
weird thing.
Well,
Yeah.
it's very, very difficult. Okay, money is
Money taboo.
it's
Yeah.
such a control thing for
Yeah.
people, and such a power thing, and it's such an
Yeah.
unspoken thing. We can't talk about it. But I also think it's really not just interesting, it's like really close to the bone for folks, and it's a very, very easy way to judge other people. I
Yeah.
find that like
Yes.
especially I live in a very well-heeled town that has sort of through COVID become much more well-heeled. Like it's become a destination for folks who just can live anywhere they want. And so they move
Mhm.
here. RJ is the same way. And Nashville's like that a little bit too.
It
But
is,
it's
yeah.
becomes a way to like, I can judge. I can just, I noticed myself, and RJ, you say you want to only be sort of you only want to accuse yourself. And so
Yes.
I want to say that I read this and there's something voyeuristic about it, and I want to judge the people. Almost all of them, basically, their narrative is not, in fact, one of control. It's one of guilt and
Yep.
hiding
Yeah.
and like burden.
Not freedom.
Yeah.
And I had the experience this past week when I was recording the audiobook for The Big Relief. I met up with a friend from boarding school who I hadn't seen in 14 years, a wonderful guy who I just love and we'd lost track of. And he was sort of updating me on everyone I knew during that phase of my life. And of course, I went to boarding school on all these scholarships and stuff
Yeah.
like that,
Yeah.
ministry, family, and all this stuff. But I had no idea how wealthy some of these people were. And he basically let me know how, oh, well, this person is this, and this person's, got this house there, and this person, every time I sit down to have coffee with them, they have like an underling coming up to get them to sign papers, for
Mhm.
some kind of thing like that. And I think of what a wonder. Like my primary association with the all the characters he mentioned was not dollar signs. It was you're protected from that. And actually, what a relief that was to be in this little incubator where you had no idea how much money people had. And then you kind of return to the real world. But it gave us a semblance of a lot of what I realized was a lot of those folks are still sort of living in that. All of their friends are their boarding school friends. And it's
The bubble.
I think it's
The
actually,
bubble.
it's not necessarily because they're all living the same life with all this money. It's because these are the people that knew them outside of that whole world. And
Yeah.
therefore they stood to have a real relationship with. And I don't know, it got to me. I think, RJ, I also, like, how many times have I thought, gosh, wouldn't it be nice to just
Wouldn't it be nice?
to be able to go on that ski
Yes.
vacation and not think
Yes.
about it?
Yeah.
And then I
Not to stress about paying for college, and
then you watch another lesson you do get to learn living in one of these well-heeled places is you just watch you never really know. Money is not a good indicator of how happy people are, at
At
least
all.
once you get to a certain. And in fact,
Isn't
the
it that
longer
like
you
once you
live,
get to the certain level, it like doesn't even matter? Yeah.
and you hear these stories, and you have no idea how horrendous things are. I've shared with you guys, but I don't know if I've shared it here, but we've had 4 funerals from self-harm of people this fall,
yeah.
and they're all well
Ugh.
resourced white young men, and like that's money equated to pressure, isolation, and certainly not telling the truth about anything. And the fact that if you can't tell the truth about anything, and none of these people are able to talk about what's really how they're living their life, like the number one thing is everyone says, "Oh, we didn't know. We had no idea. We had no
Mhm.
idea they were so unhappy." Yeah, that's because they're living in a world that doesn't tell the truth about anything, basically.
Mhm.
And that's a very, very heavy burden for people to take on. And so I don't. For me, it's another reminder of like no one walks into this church by accident, no matter how happy or happy-go-lucky they seem. sermon over, but
I love it, Dave.
I could keep going.
Yeah.
The rest of the article is fascinating. There's a bunch of immigrant kids whose parents. There's one woman who said, like, my parents used their money, financial support, just to express all their opinions about my life. But then I realized, even if they weren't giving me money, they'd still have a ton of opinions about my life. And okay, there was a long read, but one of these things that I just got to tell everyone who listens to this podcast to take 30 to 40 minutes, possibly an hour, to sit down and read this. This is in the New Yorker, and it's by Lawrence Wright, and it's called "The Nuns Trying to Save the Women on Texas's Death Row."
Wow.
You know, the headlines these days are filled with faith is all over the place. Christianity is being used in every single conceivable corner of our world, and sometimes it's hard to know what the real thing is. And this essay does not exist outside of the authentic Christian contribution to the world in a way that I found to be deeply, deeply inspiring. And okay, I'm just going to read it. East of Gatesville, outside of Waco, Texas, is a convent of contemplative Catholic nuns, the Sisters of Mary Morningstar. It's a new order. The sisters don't teach or do missionary work. They spend their days almost entirely in silence, work, and prayer. A local deacon named Ronnie visits the prison, the maximum security prison where Texas's death row female inmates are housed. And he gets to know them, and he decides to seek out these nuns. Ronnie goes out and knocks on the door of the convent. And he sits down with a woman named Sister Lydia Maria. Sister Lydia Maria's eyes got really big when Ronnie told her what was going on at the prison. "We don't go to prisons," she said firmly, although she offered to pray for the women and kindly asked their names. Prayer was what the order was created to do. Ronnie, the deacon, stayed in his seat expounding on how great his idea was that these nuns would go and visit these women on death row. The condemned women were struggling spiritually, and there was a limit to how much guidance a man could offer them. He pointed out that the nuns lived very similar lives by choice. What could be more perfect? So we hear about the nuns. The nuns prayed, then they deliberated as a group, which was unusual in a vocation where silence is the rule. The boundaries of their new order were still elastic and untested. The sisters consulted with their vicar, Sister Mary Thomas, a cheerful graduate of the University of Notre Dame who lived in a convent in Wisconsin. She mulled over the startling proposal. On the one hand, going to the prison could set an unwelcome precedent. What did it mean to be a contemplative order if instead of spending the day in silence and prayer, you ministered in prisons? And why these condemned women? The world is full of misery. On the other hand, the vicar believed in providential encounters, and such as the serendipitous knock on the door from Deacon Ronnie. She and the sisters in the convent were all unnerved by the prospect of visiting death row, but they also felt compelled to answer Ronnie's plea. Sister Lydia Maria told him, "We will meet these ladies and discuss our way of life. If it helps them, that's wonderful, but that's all this will be, nothing else." The women knew nothing about the women's crimes. They also knew little about one another. The sisters seldom speak, and the lives they've left behind are rarely discussed. It's a kind of forced naivete in which gossip and news are replaced by prayer. In the past half century, the number of Catholic nuns in America has dropped by 80% to about 36,000. The average age is 80, but the Sisters of Mary Morningstar are much younger. The average age is 38. At their convent near Waco, the nuns wake each morning before dawn and spend 2 or 3 hours praying together and chanting the Liturgy of the Hours. This is followed by solitary Bible study and contemplation. Each daily event is marked by a bell chime. After breakfast, there are classes, usually in philosophy or theology, and more prayer. Then the nuns convene in the kitchen to peel vegetables, silently. Around noon, there is more prayer, followed by Mass, more prayer, then lunch. All meals are eaten alone in the sisters' rooms, except Sunday lunch when they eat together but don't speak. At 1:30, work begins, mainly laundry, cleaning, and crafts. Sisters are encouraged to develop a personal craft. Dinner is at 7, and afterward, the sisters have a little free time. They may go for a walk or pray or read the Bible in their room. They can talk, but as one told me, they try to avoid it. It's not
that
as
was a horrible, Dave. Okay.
Well,
sorry, I've held it together for this long. Jesus. They came up with this? There's just like no talk. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, well,
Oh Lord.
they don't really know what's going on in the rest of the world.
Right.
The only way they know is by receiving
This
prayer
kind of
requests.
sounds like heaven right about now.
Well, why is he reading us all this? Because like the sisters, the condemned women, the prisoners, also rise before dawn. Melissa Lucio, an inmate who was convicted of killing her 2-year-old daughter, told me, I start each day by putting water in my hot pot to make coffee, and while the water's getting hot, I make my bed, wash my face, and get dressed for work. We work from 6:30 to 10:30. What we do is special projects. We crochet, we embroidery.
Oh, it's the same.
Darlie Routier, who was convicted of killing 2 of her children, makes stuffed animals, pigs, rabbits, dinosaurs. The women knit baby blankets too, which are sold to state employees. The women normally eat in their cells, but they gather for holidays and birthdays. Like the nuns, the condemned women spend most of their free time in their cells. Despite there being only 6 women on death row when the nuns first visited, Ronnie observed that there were cliques and hard feelings among them, which made prison life even more miserable than it had to be. He noticed on other wards that female prisoners needed community in a way that men typically didn't, and they often formed family-like units. Yet, because the condemned women inhabited a place of spiritual darkness, they could fall into spats and backbiting. If they were a family, they were a broken one. Okay, and so the sisters decide to go and visit these women. And this is what happens. We didn't know what to expect, Sister Lydia Maria recalled of the initial prison visit. The nuns, in their gray habits, found the women dressed all in white. Deacon Ronnie said words of introduction. Then Brittany, one of the inmates, says something supernatural happened. It was just instant. There wasn't a moment of discomfort. There wasn't a moment of unease. We opened our arms and they opened their arms and we embraced one another.
Wow.
Both groups were surprised that they had so much in common. The condemned women were astonished that the nuns had chosen to live a life nearly as confined as their own in rooms that they too called cells. Brittany, the inmate, said, "We talked about having a corner. I have a corner in my cell where I pray and spend time with God, and they explained that they have their own sanctuaries in their cells." Sister Lydia Maria privately noted another connection. "We are not what the world would call beautiful women. We always wear the same clothes. The prisoners cannot be afraid of us. They cannot feel lower than us. There's nothing in our appearance to make them feel not beautiful or not elegant." I'll stop there for a second because I could keep reading forever. Any thoughts on this so far? Because this is high octane stuff.
Just the God is amazing, and the miracle. What did it say that Deacon Ronnie or somebody believed, or the Mother Superior believed in God's providence? That the way He works things together, the way that He I don't know, brings hope in unexpected places and forges relationships that shouldn't exist. And it's just incredibly hopeful. And it also reminds me of what I think, Mark Galli, I think, wrote an article on Christianity Today a few years ago about people's hunger for sort of relevance. Like, I want to be relevant. I want to do something relevant, and how that wasn't necessarily a Christian impulse. But I think in that article, he said, that the amazing thing about Christian is you go around the world, go to the deepest, darkest hellholes, the places of despair and forgottenness, and you'll always find Christians working there. You won't hear about it. It's not relevant work. You'll hear about it in the New Yorker in this article, but yeah.
The New Yorker article goes through each one of the things that these women did. You do find out what they did, and we've heard that some of them have had, murdered children. There's one woman who set her babysitter on fire. Like, you don't land on death row for, mistaken identity or something. Like, these are gruesome things. And of course, you also learn that every single one of these inmates has had a horrific past of the most abuse you could possibly imagine. Just terrible things. The nuns, almost all of which have had pretty good upbringings. And one of them even says in the middle of his, I wish that my sister inmate the inmate had been spared such terrible things, but I also know that without her sufferings, she would not have the thirst for God that she has today.
Oof.
And the guy who's writing the article is like, he doesn't quite know how to deal with that. But then this experience gets so under his skin, Lawrence Wright, that he has to unpack his entire spiritual history as well within the article, because what he's seeing is so otherworldly and strange. Because what happens, what really happens is that these women, all of them, the nuns and the other women, they kind of form a family and a community, and all of the inmates end up getting baptized, Catholics, but they all have their deaths looming over them. And they start to cook food for each other and have meals together. And their experience of prison becomes so much less miserable, to the extent that all of them essentially see God's providence in bringing them to death row. It is bizarre. Sarah, before I read a couple more paragraphs, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I just feel like the nuns decided they could fall in love with line cooks. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's something about like how different their lives are. And I've worked in women's prisons before, and I just, yeah, there's some really horrible things they do. And I gotta say, like 99% of the time, there's something really horrible that happened to them as children. And these nuns are just like, these women have nothing to offer, right? They don't have health insurance. They don't have, you know what I mean? Like they don't have any of these things, and they're crossing this chasm. I've been thinking a lot about like the importance of platonic relationships with women. And I'm working on a talk that I'm doing at St. George's here in Nashville at the end of February, and just how life-giving and crucial. And I mean, I have to be honest with you, and I know that, I mean, I can't imagine we have a lot of nuns that listen to the podcast, but when I hear about a whole group of women living in a building together and never getting to talk, that sounds horrible to me, and like a living nightmare. And I also love what this has done for these nuns, right?
Yeah.
That they've gotten to know each other. Like, what a beautiful blessing. Like, they are sharing their histories and their thoughts, and I hope they're gossiping a little. Like, what a beautiful thing, So
That's so funny you say it exactly that way, Sarah, because this next passage, Darley, who's one of the inmates who had done something horrific that I'm not going to repeat, she says she wasn't raised particularly religious, but was baptized into the Catholic Church in 2021, largely because of Deacon Ronnie's influence. She said she'd never spent any time with nuns. She said, I was thinking they were more stiff and rigid, and that they were not like that at all. They weren't always nuns. Some had careers. They still struggle with things like we all do daily. She added, it was like we had known them all our lives. There was no hesitation. We all hugged and immediately started talking. Melissa, another inmate, grew up Catholic, but she'd never met a nun either. The fact that nuns had overcome their own trials and tribulations gave her hope. She said, I get peace from them. I'm a new creation today. I'm not the same woman that I used to be. As the nuns departed, they passed Erica Shepherd in her cell. She'd converted to Islam nearly 2 decades earlier, but the nuns asked her name and said that they were praying for her. At the time, Erica had no teeth, but she, quote, gave us a big smile. Sister Lydia Maria recalled, something from heaven happened on the first visit. Once outside, the nuns told Ronnie, we came here so afraid and thinking we were going to minister to these women. And oh my goodness, they ministered to us. Sister Pia Maria observed, we're connected because we're sinners. I'm not saying we killed anybody, but we're not perfect. Maybe because of our studies of metaphysics, we can understand the human person better and receive them with dignity and respect, regardless of what crime they committed. More than that, though, all of the women, sort of the nuns, get involved, because I don't know, Pope Francis had changed the Catholic teaching about, death penalty is unequivocally evil in Catholic Church teaching now. There used to be some provision for it, but they have become the ministers and this whole community has kind of become wrapped up with one another in the most beautiful ways. It's like, why this contemplative order that is supposed to be retreated from the world is somehow told to go and visit women on death row. They don't want to do it. They get there and they find that the Holy Spirit sort of has gone before them, and these relationships occur. They're able to heal divisions within the fractured community. They're able to share their lives, and they get healed in the process. Meanwhile, they bear witness to these women dying and allow them to die with not just dignity. They all say, "I will see you again. I will." That's their dying words to them. It's just one of these articles. I guess I'm saying is that people need to read it. I cried numerous times during it, and there's no explanation for an article like this outside of Jesus Christ. These women say the worst moment of their life when they were convicted was also the best moment of their life, because Jesus was standing right there beside them, and they could finally, no more hiding, and they could finally he too was convicted and put to death. I mean, it was just Sorry, what else do you think?
It made me think of something we say at funerals a lot of the time. In the midst of life, we are in death. And how that is true for all of us. But that it's obviously much more present and true in a more palpable way for these women living on death row. And it also made me think of what Stephen Colbert said about, the moment you recognize that you're grateful for the thing that you most wished had not happened. And for these women to somehow see their presence on death row to be God's grace in their lives, to bring sort of peace and healing and relationship, community, love in a way that they probably had never experienced before and would have never experienced had they not found themselves in that place. And I guess the last thing is, Dave, you said something earlier about, I'm not going to tell people that everyone needs to go marry Jesus or something, right? But that's what these nuns have done. And of course, the good news of the gospel is that Jesus has married us. He is the bridegroom and we are the bride, and he has linked himself to us inextricably, even though we are sinners. Even though we betray him and go our own way, he has married himself to us, and he's coming back for us. And which that's the hope, right? No matter what we've done.
I was thinking about a funeral I went to this weekend. The neighbor, I grew up with a pretty tight group of neighbors on our street, and the neighbor 2 doors down had a kid my age, and he's now an adult, and he had a son who died at 13 last week, who had and I didn't know this neighbor well. Honestly, the only reason I went to the funeral is because I could hear my parents saying they live 20 minutes away and you need to drive to the funeral. So that's why I went to the funeral. I hadn't kept up with his family at all, but he had some disabilities that it sounds like just, he wasn't going to be able to survive. But it was such a beautiful thing to go to, because his dad, what I remember of his dad was that he was really mischievous, really funny, pushed all the boundaries. And it sounds like once this kid got a hold of the ability to type and email, he did the exact same thing. And like his teacher got up. It was so beautiful. Like they had his teacher come, and she talked about how she was a Yankees fan and he didn't hate anything more than the Yankees. And so this kid from his wheelchair would type her emails that were just like, how does it feel to root for the worst team on the planet, And it was it was so good. I mean, it was so funny. And like, I think we look at somebody like a nun or a prisoner and we think, oh my God, worst thing ever, like worst existence ever. Like your life has no meaning. Like, what are you doing? And these people were believers. And when I say believers, Henny, I don't mean like Episcopal believers. I mean, these were Baptist believers. And so, if you want to go to a funeral, go to a Baptist funeral, because the way that they talk about Jesus is unmatched.
Mm.
And it's uncomfortable. And it's uncomfortable even for me. And it's also really necessary. And I remember several people got up and said, we are so thankful that Jesus gave us 13 years with this little boy.
Mm.
And I was just like, oh my God, but Jesus took him so early, you know, but like that was where they were in it. And I guess this article makes me think a lot about how, you know, when I lost my parents, there were so many people from the outside that were like, how can you forgive? Or how can you be faithful? Or how can you whatever? And it's like, it's kind of inexplicable until you're in the situation. And I think for these nuns, I think for these prisoners, I think for this kid's parents, it's like somehow there is this greater, brighter shore that we have this reassurance that we're gonna meet again, and you know, and we just give thanks for the time that we've been given together.
Wow.
So,
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like what we're saying is that these nuns, these death row inmates, and this young man in a wheelchair
mhm,
sound significantly more serene and
mhm,
um, full of joy and gratitude than the trust fund
yeah,
folks in New
yeah,
York. None of
yeah,
whom, by the way, chose their situation.
right,
But it
right.
is interesting. The juxtaposition is jarring.
It
RJ.
is.
Well, and that's what I thought too, Dave, that I think as a parent, but also just as a person in the world, you know, that if you think that the best you can do is to save people you love from hard situations, right? To be a snowplow parent,
Mm,
to keep them out of jail, keep them out of rehab, keep them out of poverty, keep them out of hunger, keep them out of pain, that's the best thing for them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not true.
right.
It's a lie, right? Because that's where God shows up, and what you're actually probably doing is kind. And you can't do it because God breaks through anyway, right? They do everything they can, and their kids are still experiencing the pain of guilt and anxiety and shame and you know, all this sort of stuff. And hopefully God will meet those trust fund kids in the same way that he's meeting these women on death row. But yeah, if you're a snowplow parent just trying to remove every obstacle, you're not doing your kid any favors. And to embrace, you know, to embrace the hard things, to embrace the poverty that you experience, the pain that you experience, knowing that is where God shows up, and that's where God's going to meet you, and that's where you can actually, where, I don't know, that's where the kingdom of God is born, right? That's what we're talking about in this prison outside Waco. The kingdom of God is being made manifest on earth in that place.
Indeed, like
Yeah.
100%.
Yes.
And yeah, I remember trying to help a friend who was really in the throes of addiction and asking a treasured mentor, like, what do I do? How can I prevent more suffering? And she said to me, it's like, Dave, that person has an appointment with God, and you can
Ooh,
only
Dave.
you can only get in the way. Like
God.
you can only get in the way. You need to allow. And I thought, oh, damn it, you know. But it was also like,
But what
you know,
hope and freedom?
by the way,
you know,
she was right.
Yeah.
And the second I took my
Yes.
hands off the wheel, much better
Yes.
things happened. I'm going to read a final little thing here from my father to sort of put some theology around what we're talking about. This is something he found in an old box that he wrote 40 years ago. About stirring up hope. You know, we're surrounded, a lot of people who listen to us are involved in churches that are struggling, or churches that they would love to see do better. And, you know, we really do have something to say about this. And a lot of people have, I thought we were going to put some shape around it. In the words my dad wrote 40 years ago, based on reviving two churches that were really in terrible shape when he got there. He wrote this. He says, "For me, a strategy of rebuilding begins with a personal religious conviction. It is the conviction of God's grace. This conviction says that the bottom line of human existence is the grace of God, or God's unconditional love for humanity on the basis of the cross. This conviction says that the warpedness of human experience lies in some form or another of judgment, perceived or actual, that the root of human anxiety is fear of rejection, and that God on the cross has absorbed on our behalf the absolute totality of all our rejections and feelings of rejection. So you and I are free from demand. Such freedom from demand is the essence of graceful living. Grace is a threat to my need for control, he writes. It says I have no control whatsoever over my ultimate status and worth in life. It says that such worth is a gift given by God by means of a transfer of moral perfection from Jesus Christ to us who look to him. Does this then lead to amorality because of the absence of control? Does it lead to indiscipline and moral indifference? Not at all. It leads to overflowing thankfulness for what God has done for me in my lost and needy narcissism. The actual experience of Christians down the ages is that grace leads to holiness and not the other way around. To bring this down to earth, we seek in everything we consciously do in our church to give out the word of God's grace. We announce right from the start that any congregation where grace is preached is going to lose control. That may sound ominous at first, but when offered with a little humor, it is disarming and reassuring. What a burden can be lifted down then. I cannot save my parish, nor can anything I do save my parish. But because of God's grace, any church can always be saved, and great things may be accomplished. The grace of God puts the burden off you and me to do anything, and puts it squarely where it belongs. In the context of a non-judgmental relationship with God, I will be enabled to love other people non-judgmentally. And this fresh kind of loving will, in time, take varied active forms in terms of service in the church and to the world. An unremitting emphasis on God's gift, joined to a lot of TLC, tender loving care, and personal outreach, created a situation in which, after a few years at my last church, the giftedness of that diverse congregation began to spill over. And everything from a shelter for the homeless to a thriving ministry to artists to increased outreach giving to a remarkably loving and healing fellowship emerged. A mission strategy of grace has a lot to contribute in terms of dealing with divisions within a parish. For one thing, the law does not minister effectually to bad blood. In other words, I cannot exhort people out of their animosities. Exhortation may, in fact, cause people to feel even worse about themselves. The way to deal with chronic inherited divisions is not to take sides, nor even to deal with the issue on its own terms. Rather, lift up the center, which is God's grace and its life-altering power, and other things will not seem so important. The brightness of the center will eclipse the rather dark light of all the other agendas. Divisions will always be latent within us, let alone within our parishes, but they lose much of their power to hurt and sting when the center is restored. Another strategic pastoral implication of grace is that we are not perfectionists. None of us will ever achieve anything remotely like perfection so long as we are human. Therefore, I cannot divide my parish, even in my own mind, into arrived and non-arrived people, spiritually minded and worldly, renewed and unrenewed, even liberals and conservatives. I will never cease to be surprised at who responds to grace and who does not. I can never know the inward facts of a person well enough. So I address them all as believers, impute to them all the grace of God, and trust the Holy Spirit to do the convicting work. I don't know. I think it's pretty beautiful.
Spot on.
I cannot exhort people out of their animosities. What a line. But this notion that sometimes we're told that to preach grace is not enough to preach the gospel. And it's certainly the experience of our church, by the way, where we do so much service and so much varied service, but it's all sort of emerged from people who feel welcomed, encouraged, included, forgiven, and loved. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, you want to lead a mission trip to Honduras. Oh, you want to do a prison ministry.
Mhm.
Oh, you want to do a grief group. Oh, you want to talk about infertility with other people. Like these things sort of emerge, but out of the non-perfectionistic impulse that isn't looking to perform or achieve. Such beautiful things can happen. But RJ, you're actually running a church. Do you have anything to say about this?
I felt, I hate to say this, I felt like kind of affirmed by it to some degree, because I feel like it just gave voice to what I feel like I'm trying to do, and imperfectly, like I'm not doing this right, but I feel like, yeah, treating people as they're Christians, telling them they're loved, telling them they're forgiven, help them to get in touch with their pain, talking about real life, staying away from divisive, partisan things, but talking to everyone and myself as if we're all sinners saved by grace, trying not to control things, seeing what bubbles up, just gratitude. But I feel like I'm part of this group of rectors, and Josh is part of it too. I feel like to some degree we're all experiencing this at our churches. That this is the approach to ministry that we've taken, and it's not easy, but ministry in general. But this makes it a little bit easier, and also allows you to continue to love your people. Who are just broken sinners like yourself, rather than having some sort of spiritual program for them. Or, I think he used the phrase, I'm not a spiritual sheriff. That's not my job.
He uses that elsewhere in the piece. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're actually going to talk about it. We have the first meeting of our new vestry next week, and I think we're going to talk about this article as kind of a beautiful and succinct, piece on what it is we're trying to be and do as a church.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Sarah, what do you think?
Well, I love how timeless this is. I love that it got pulled out of a box, and it's still exactly what people, I think, should be doing in ministry. And also, I think there's a lot of theologians that might look back on what they wrote 40 years ago and be like, oh my God, I can't believe that. Do you know what I mean? And
this is not aged well.
Especially if we think about like 40 years ago in the Episcopal Church, like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, who knows? Yeah. And like, he just could have made a whole statement that said like, we don't, what is it? Like those horrible posters we used to have in the Episcopal Church, like, don't check your brain at the door or whatever. What I mean? These really, like truly he could have written something like that. And he wrote this, and it still holds up, and it's still beautiful, and it's still true. And also it's so freeing. I mean, we have conversations all the time about, how little control we have. And how this isn't our church. Josh says all the time to his people, this is your church. This is not my church. Like, I will come, I will go. This is your church. And, I think we all in Christianity, there's always this, I'm not going to say we all, because we don't, but I think there's this overwhelming thing in ministry that it's like, you have to have the most people in the doors. And we want this place to be full every week. And I'm just like, that's such a nice thought. You have zero control over that. You just do. You have zero control over that. You preach the gospel. You show up for your people. You love them pastorally. You recognize when things are hard for them. You reach out to them more. And that's all you can do. Like you actually, this is not a numbers game. It's just not. It's grace. And so that's a really scary thing to kind of let go of, but like, it's also just a beautiful thing to find freedom in. The other thing I just want to say about this from a non clergy perspective is, the way that your dad talks about how this theology informs people doing things. Because, and I say this a lot, but I always feel like it bears worth repeating, because the criticism that we get at Mockingbird is often, oh, you just tell people about grace, and then what? Like, when do you tell them what to do? Like, to talk about the Fresh Air episode with Nadia Boltz-Weber, where Terry Gross was like, well, then when do you tell them what to do? And I think one of the beautiful things about like a personal faith and a personal faith based in grace is sometimes you just look up and you're like, so I'm having this experience this week. So Annie our kids go to this school that is like, basically communist. I'm just kidding, but kind of. It's like a ton of immigrant kids. It's like, I think it's like 10 to 15% white. It's just a whole sort of different environment. Huge disparity in terms of economics. And they are doing, they do homerooms, but they're like very social emotional, but they're gender based. So like Annie's only with girls for parts of stuff, which is like amazing. And they recognize.
Sounds very traditional.
I know, isn't it weird? They have these little things. You're like, oh, okay.
I'm all in. I love that.
I know. So, so they recognized, and you guys don't have daughters, so you don't understand this, the brutality that is Valentine's Day for a 5th grade girl. Okay. It's just weird and awkward. And if you're getting something from a boy, it's awkward. And if you're not getting something from a boy, it's awkward. So they're like, we're going to do a Galentine's Day party for every girl in the grade. And so it's like 60 girls. So we get this email that goes out and it's like, hey, like, you know, can you bring brownies, basically? And I just thought, what is a crazy thing I could do? Like, what is a crazy thing? And I was like, I could make an incredible gift bag for these girls. Like, I'm going to go buy all of the nonsense bullshit, you know, single-use plastics, because, you know, those are my love language, at Target. I'm going to fill these with candy, and I just want them to feel so special. And also, I want those to be in the room when they get in there. I don't want it to be like, Annie's mom brought these. These are from Annie, right? Like, I want this to be a part of the party. And like, that's not a thing I would do if I weren't like a grace Christian. I just wouldn't have done that. Like, I wouldn't, I certainly wouldn't be spending my time, my money, my energy. Like, I wouldn't be doing that. And our baptismal covenant says, like, you know, respect the dignity of every human being. That still wouldn't have done it for me, you know, enough to do this. Like, it is just like, it's a graciousness, and it's a giving it away. And it's, you know, it's nuns showing up at a prison, and it's a kid in a wheelchair with an email address hassling his teachers. Like, it's just this like abundance out of what everyone else in the world thinks is nothing.
Did they flip out, or they have?
Oh, it's happening on Friday. I can't
happening.
wait. Yeah, it's happening on Friday.
And boys are gonna go play paintball.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Well, I want to leave it there. That's a beautiful, beautiful place to leave it. And there's a couple stories in that nuns article about the feasts, the feasts that they have on death row with these ladies that have got to. It's heaven. You kind of can't. You're like,
it's heaven.
It's the kingdom of God in there, and it's all born out of creative love, spontaneous. There's no playbook. No one's following any should. You know, it's just it's an outpouring and a superabundance. But thank you for sharing that, Sarah. I hope that goes as well as I imagine it will. That it can't not.
Yeah.
But thank you both for showing up today, and I guess we will talk again in a couple weeks. So yeah, happy post-Valentine's Day, post-Galentine's Day to all of you out there. Rutger, be well, and we'll talk to you guys in a couple weeks.
Okay.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Remember, you can find us on the web at www.mbird.com. And we'd always love to hear from you at info@mbird.com. Audio production for the Mockingcast is provided by TJ Hester. And if you like what you've heard, please drop over to iTunes and leave us a rating or review. Until next time.